The year is 1948. Europe is digging itself out from the rubble of a world war, and a 49-year-old American woman steps off a gondola onto the moss-slicked stairs of Venice. Peggy Guggenheim arrives as a survivor. She has lived through 2 marriages and the death of a great love on a hospital table. And while a continent collapsed, she spent the war years buying Picassos while Paris fell, eventually sifting through the wreckage to evacuate an entire collection from a war zone. The stairs she steps onto belong to a crumbling, unfinished structure on the water's edge, the Palazzo Veniere dei Leoni. She is the most important private collector of modern art in the Western world, and she has never needed to be told she belongs somewhere. Yet, having never stood in these particular rooms before, she feels an immediate, inexplicable certainty that she has come home. Guggenheim had walked into a house where, decades earlier, the Marchesa Luisa Casati had attempted to organize a human life entirely around beauty, conducted at maximum pitch until the money ran out. It raises the question of what survives when an aesthetic is treated as a moral code. To understand why Casati turned a palazzo into a laboratory, we have to look at the man who designed the theory. At the turn of the century, the Italian novelist and aviator Gabriele D'Annunzio became the intellectual instigator of a radical new aestheticism. This diagram visualizes his core thesis. When you place traditional ethics on one side of a scale and aesthetics on the other, aesthetics dramatically outweighs standard morality. D'Annunzio taught a generation that beauty was a moral position, requiring no other justification. His ideas were highly contagious. His seductions consumed his era, radiating through the work of modern artists and deeply influencing those closest to him, including the actress Eleonora Duse. But an aesthetic philosophy completely divorced from ethics is highly volatile. Fascist forces eventually borrowed and weaponized D'Annunzio's ideology, utilizing visual spectacle to mobilize crowds. This application culminated in his catastrophic military occupation of the city of Fiume. Following that collapse, he retreated to the Vittoriale. He built a museum-like estate, obsessively carving his philosophy into stone reliefs and architecture to create a physical manifestation of his worldview. D'Annunzio provided the theory. He taught that life itself could be a work of art, provided one had the courage and the capital to ignore the consequences. Marchesa Luisa Casati took D'Annunzio at his word. She took over the Venetian palazzo to test the limits of his theory, attempting to live a life governed entirely by aesthetic impulse rather than social or financial restraint. Casati conducted her life at maximum pitch. She reigned over Europe for 10 years by walking cheetahs on diamond leashes down the street and filling her palazzo's ballroom with 10,000 moths at midnight. This level of extravagance had a fixed transactional cost. Casati maintained her visual illusion right up until the exact moment her vast fortune was exhausted. Look at this chart mapping the timeline of her bankruptcy. Watch how her financial capital depletes to zero at the peak of her fame. The crash stripped away her gold leaf garden and left the most talked-about woman in Europe with only 40 personal objects. She spent her final days in a single room in Chelsea. All the wealth was gone, leaving only the reality of the street outside and her own undiminished ties. Casati's bankruptcy suggests that while a life can be curated like a gallery, it still requires the same capital that funds more mundane lives. Once the fortune vanished, the experiment ended. Which brings us back to 1948. When Peggy Guggenheim steps into the Palazzo Veniere dei Leoni, she walks into the site of Casati's former experiment. In Guggenheim's hands, the palazzo shifted from a stage for personal performance to a permanent sanctuary for the modern art the previous era had birthed. She acted as the final curator. By sifting through the wartime wreckage of Europe to buy Pollocks when no one else would, she saved the tangible results of a culture that had nearly destroyed itself. The individuals who drove the Belle Époque are gone. Their fortunes are long spent. Yet the palazzo and the city around it remain as witnesses to the lives conducted within them. The stones remember, because while the individuals and their fortunes were eventually exhausted, the collection they fought to assemble remains. The ruin of a life lived solely for beauty is often total, but the art salvaged is the only evidence that survives the century.